over to you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Robert. We're so fortunate, and I'm so glad to have you leading our research and technology work, and to have you in the reestablished position as our lead science officer as well. And to Anne, thank you for your leadership, and to everyone at the team at Volpe for what you're doing. It feels like I so often hear about something exciting and innovative coming over the horizon in our department, and learn that it was the Volpe team that helped make it possible. And to everyone who's joining us, I want to thank you for your interest and your work on improving transportation around the US and around the world. As Robert laid out, we have enormous challenges and we have enormous opportunities for us in this moment. Even before the pandemic, we know that the status quo wasn't working for many Americans, and it's why we need to be prepared to think and act in new and different ways. In other words, to innovate. And I also think it's important that we do so not trying to pursue innovation as an end in itself, but with a sense of purpose. Good innovation is always in the service of specific goals. And I really appreciate that the theme of the 2021 Volpe series puts innovation squarely in the service of two of our department's current core priorities, climate and equity. So when it comes to transportation, the question before us is, what will be the era-defining climate and equity innovations of our time? I'm convinced that we are at the cusp of a transformational moment in transportation policy and investment, largely because of the American Jobs Plan, which puts forward the resources and, just as importantly, the policies that we would need to modernize every aspect of our transportation system. And I'll mention just a couple examples. One, the plan would create a new Safe Streets for All program. This is, of course, important for many reasons and important to everybody in some way, but it's certainly a matter of equity. On our roads, the fatality rate for Black people is twice the rate for white people. So there is a matter of fairness and justice woven into that mission. The jobs plan would also fund a new program to reconnect neighborhoods cut off by past transportation decisions, often federally funded decisions, and it will increase equity in future outcomes while reducing pollution and emissions in many cases. Doing these kinds of things at scale require major investments. And another thing that we know is that when we place public investments the right way, it unleashes a scale effect that makes it truly transformative. And this has been seen again and again in our history. Take the invention of the airplane, for example, an incredibly important development. But in many ways, it was really only once the FDR administration established a network of airports using resources that were part of the New Deal that we reached the scale that made it possible to have a full-blown aviation sector really helping to transform this country. And so in ways that rhyme with that era in particular, the jobs plan can bring climate action visions and equity programs to a scale that then lifts up communities across the country. I also see a chance before us to demonstrate how job creation is inseparable from addressing climate inequity. The president's plan would create millions of good jobs, retrofitting buildings, installing electric vehicle chargers, laying new transit lines, expanding rail to new communities, all steps that also ultimately reduce carbon emissions. And these are jobs that pay enough to support a family. And the majority will be available to people whether you have a college degree or not. So the American Jobs Plan is showing how infrastructure, climate, equity, job creation all go hand in hand. A great example here is electric vehicles. We know their clear and revolutionary climate impact, but I think we haven't fully thought through their potential equity impact. Electric vehicles, after all, save their owners a lot of money over time as gas savings overtake the upfront cost premium. So EVs can actually be more impactful for lower income people and for people in rural communities who, of course, tend to drive more. And yet today, EVs are viewed as a luxury item, primarily purchased by wealthier Americans and primarily driven by Americans in cities. Solving that could mean cleaner air and more mobility options where they would be needed most. So I think this is an opportunity for us to think about the moonshots that we have a chance to pursue, but often that means looking right at our feet instead of only to the stars. A minor obsession of mine in our research agenda has to do with performance materials, ways that roads can last longer and can be more resilient to climate change. so that drivers have fewer potholes and safer trips, but also so that communities have huge savings and are able to spend money on something other than repairing roads that are constantly degraded. And of course, there's some exciting work on asphalt pavement innovations that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in these unsexy dimensions, as well as the things that are more likely to seize headlines, the 2020s are shaping up to be an incredibly fertile and perhaps transformative period in the field that we all work in. And I think we're very fortunate to have such a remarkable team at Volpe and such an amazing community of people who care about these issues to help us find solutions. I want to mention that the Department of Transportation will soon be releasing a framework and set of principles that are going to guide our innovation work as a department, so that across the department we are coordinated and aligned and making sure all of our work is in service of our shared goals and values. And Volpe's given a terrific head start to us in that regard. So I can't wait to see the ways that Volpe and Robert's team and all of us who are involved in this event are going to make transportation better, cleaner, more equitable, more accessible. And we're going to give ourselves a lot to be proud of, I think, from having been in a position to do this work in this era. So excited about your work, excited about our work, and looking forward to a conversation with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those remarks. We're going to move now into the part of the program where we'll have some Q&A. I'll serve as the moderator. And so let's take a couple of these questions. So the first one here from Richard Mudge asks, the Biden's plan major focus on technology concerns speeding the deployment of electric vehicles. What role do you see for automated vehicles? That's the question.
You know, part of how I've thought about it is that if we take an aviation metaphor, the development of electric vehicles are as transformative as the transition from propeller to jet aircraft, maybe more so. I would liken the impact of truly automated vehicles to be more like the difference between air travel and space travel. I mean, it could be an absolutely profound shift in surface transportation in America. The safety benefits are especially exciting and appealing. I know there's a lot of concern about the safety of automated vehicles that needs to be addressed. But obviously, human drivers haven't had the best track record, and so there's a huge potential, no matter how good we get at behavioral factors for human drivers in automated vehicles. I'm also very excited from a disability perspective, what it could mean, because it just transforms mobility for so many people. I'm excited from a land use perspective because widespread adoption of automated vehicles could mean a very different set of needs and expectations around surface parking in cities, which as a former mayor is something that I saw a lot of great ideas break down over. There's also some tremendous concerns, especially around emissions, actually. Even if we're talking about zero tailpipe emissions, cars still need energy, and AVs, frankly, are likely to mean more cars on the road. You just have one less reason not to drive because you don't have to drive. The car drives you, and that could lead to a proliferation of vehicles on the road. Could help with congestion in some ways because they can optimize their patterns, but the sheer numbers that it could put on the road, I think, are something to really be concerned about. And the jury's out on what this means economically, because it has, again, a set of exciting efficiency potential outcomes, but also it's not clear that the industry is fully ready for the idea of vehicles as a service rather than as something you own. It's exciting that we may be moving toward a world, partly because of automation, where a family's second most expensive possession, which is your house, is no longer this object that just sits there 94% of the time, but automated vehicles would kind of constantly be in motion. But we haven't really thought through all the ramifications of that. So all of these are exciting things that obviously need to inform our research and innovation agenda, from the just technical dimensions of this, how to make sure it's safe, how to optimize the movement of these vehicles. By the way, preparing for AVs is as much about smart roadways as it is smart vehicles. In fact, in many ways, it's really there that we want to begin, so that we could establish kind of corridors where, at least on the commercial side, you could accelerate adoption. But I think we should be spending just as much time thinking about these second order effects. What's going to happen to land use, to families' travel patterns and commuting patterns, to the macroeconomic picture. And I know there's a lot of brain power on this call that can think about or has been thinking about that. And I'll be excited to pursue these things with you because even though I know the universal adoption of electric cars has been 6 or 7 years away for at least the last 10 years or so, I think it really is the case that the 2020s will mark a step change in the availability and the adoption of truly automated surface vehicle transportation.
Okay, good. Thank you for that answer. I think these are really great questions coming in, so we could probably spend lots of time on each one of them. But we'll move on to the next one from Bob Watts from the audience. We're on the verge of a historic infrastructure bill that may finally include fixed year funding year over year for Amtrak. Will it include money for expanding the current system, building out HighSpeed Rail, and the much needed and much delayed North-South rail link in Boston? Okay.
So as the question notes, we have a highway trust fund in this country. We have an airport trust fund in this country. We don't have that for rail, and this bill could be an opportunity to deal with that. The short answer to the question is yes, it contemplates funds for the kinds of expansions and improvements that we need. Part of it, of course, is just looking after what we have. But the reason we set such an ambitious number, $80 billion for rail, is to make sure that we're able to really expand passenger rail options, making sure that we enhance what we have, making sure that we introduce new routes and introduce more places where true high speed can be put into effect. Now, candidly, this is not enough for a fully built out national high-speed rail network to happen overnight. It is enough to be able to demonstrate to a level we haven't yet done as a country just how good America could get and how much America could benefit from high-speed rail across some significant city pairs. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so excited, and one of the reasons why the president has been emphatic across these negotiations about the importance of looking after rail. I figured out early on that I'm only ever going to be the number 2 train enthusiast in this administration, but I work to make it a close second, and you'll see that reflected at every turn in the work we're doing on the jobs plan.
Excellent. We have a next question about generational transformation, actually. So this is from Lily Louder from down in San Antonio, Texas. As the youngest Secretary of Transportation ever, what are your plans for engaging the next generation's youth and young adults in creating our transportation system of the future?
Well, it's a great question. We need to recruit great, diverse, talented young people into transportation as an industry and into this place as a department. We've got a lot of, if you just look at the numbers and the demographics of our workforce, we've got a lot of openings in the coming years in the 55,000 some positions right here at USDOT. Not to mention a remarkable range of fields calling for people at every level of education in some really compelling work. I mean, I think a lot of us grew up with childhood fantasies of getting to work every day on anything from heavy construction equipment to aircraft. Many people in the transportation community in some way or another got to actually live that dream, as I feel that I'm doing as Secretary of Transportation. So I think the biggest thing we need to do is keep that spark alive in young people. Start early, start as early as grade school and middle school. Pay special attention to people who haven't always seen themselves reflected in transportation leadership. Reach out to students of color. Make sure women and girls understand their equal and equitable potential for leadership and success in these fields. And then thinking a little closer to the age cohort of people who are entering into the workforce, I think it's time for a new call to service to let people know that they could be part of these transformational things happening in the 2020s that we'll be proud of for the rest of our lives. I mean, some of the biggest challenges before our country, whether we're talking about justice and equity, certainly when we're talking about climate, depend on transportation. They depend on getting these things right. And so I know that future historians will romanticize the blocking and tackling we're doing right now in this field. And we should put people in touch with the excitement of that, invite them to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I have to take this opportunity to just point out we had university transportation centers, 41 of them around the country, with 2 or 3 universities in the consortiums, and those UTCs have connections into high schools, middle schools, community colleges, and so there are activity about getting the next generation excited, engaged in designing the future of the transportation system. So next question we have from Heather Richardson. As a longtime renter, I have never felt that an electric vehicle is within reach because we park on the street. So she's a renter and has to park on the street. Is there a strategic plan to increase publicly available chargers, particularly that includes low cost for underserved populations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, gets to this point that we can't have electric vehicles just be a luxury item, especially because the greatest cost savings would make the most to lower income Americans. So this is part of what we're trying to achieve in the jobs plan with the president's goal of installing a network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers around the country. Look, there are some places where you wouldn't need policymakers to get involved. It'll be so profitable that companies will do it and are doing it already. But if you just left it to that side of the market, a lot of people would be underserved, which is why we know it's important, especially to hit scale and adoption, that we make these choices as a country and as an administration. That's why we're seeking to finance these things. And it is especially important in urban environments. Look, if you're in a rural area, it's actually a lot easier because you're much more likely to live in a detached house with a garage. You literally just plug it into the wall. Much more complicated for people renting in dense urban environments. But it can be done, both encouraging buildings and facilities and on-street parking to have these kinds of charging resources. So those are exactly the kinds of things we're looking at and teaming up with the Department of Energy to try to deliver. And we'll have the means to do it if we can get the jobs plan through Congress.
Yeah, thanks for that. Having chargers available, but also parking has come up multiple times already as a key enabler for many things. Another question here. This one I'm going to read verbatim. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time today and your service to our country. My question is, what administrative changes is the department planning to place the greatest emphasis on climate and equity into the way grants and funding allocations are made for transportation projects?
Great question. Let me say that we've really been doing it from the beginning within the authorities that we have. So when the infra grant went out, for example, very early in this administration, I think for the first time, really, we specified our expectations around climate and around racial equity among the things that grant applicants should communicate and include in their plans as they're competing for those discretionary funds. We're also making sure that it's part of how we think as a team, ensuring in everything from the external outreach that we're doing to the ways that we train top leaders in this department, that we're all climate literate and all well informed about the equity considerations that are at stake in every decision we make, whether we realize it or not. So we'd better be more intentional about it. There are other things that we would need legislation to do. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the jobs plan contemplates a specific policy direction of reconnecting divided communities, which, if we're able to do that, would of course touch off a whole line of effort within the department that I think will also reflect back into our culture in a positive way. It starts at the top. This is something that's certainly important to the president. It's important to me. And I think it's also coming from the bottom up, though. It's really important to advocates and citizens around the U.S. that we be paying attention to these issues because they feel the impact. And that's one of the many reasons I think it's so exciting to be doing this work at this particular moment in history that we come to this opportunity.
Good. Thank you for that answer. While the emphasis on converting the auto fleet to electric is an important step in reducing carbon emissions, but at the same time, we must reduce driving and the exposure of people walking biking to vehicles, so vulnerable road users. Fatalities are trending upward, and it's an imperative for us to get those down. What priorities will the administration move forward to increase safety for people making trips, not by car, but by transit, walking, and biking?
Yeah, this is another thing that I think is really important. And actually, I'll put the question back to you, Robert, afterwards, because I'd be interested in how some of our research agenda might bear on these multimodal opportunities and active transportation. But I'll tell you from my perspective, this is one of the reasons why in the coverage of the jobs plan, for example, everybody's talking about the numbers, and the numbers are very important and they're very big. But just as important is what policies are attached to those numbers, right? We shouldn't be putting hundreds of billions of dollars into building infrastructure the exact same way we would have if this were 1970 instead of 2020. We know things, we know better than to do certain things the way we used to do them. And one of the things we know is that we should put the human being at the center of our transportation vision. In other words, vehicles should revolve around the needs of the human being and not the other way around. And that has to be reflected in the design of our roadways. It's why we believe in complete streets. It has to be reflected in the incentives that we create and our sense of what drives safety, which is why we have to pay attention to things like speed. It's why there has to be a lot of integrity in the resources available to encourage pedestrian and bicycle and other forms of mobility. And that's before you even get into the congestion climate implications. The safety implications alone compel us to do more and do better on this. Same with transit and rail. But it starts by making sure it's actually available. Well, that does take resources. And it's why it's so important in our jobs plan and that vision. Yes, we need to make sure vehicles are greener, but we also need to make sure people have more alternatives to bringing your vehicle. You shouldn't have to drag 2 tons of metal with you everywhere you're going. And in too many of our communities, that's what you're compelled to do. Let me mention just one other thing, which is the importance of doing this work on an interagency basis. For the electric vehicles, they're only as green as the power going into them, which is why we work so closely with the Department of Energy and Secretary Granholm's team. Similarly, your ability to get from point A to point B depends an awful lot on where point A and B turn out to be. And that's why things like transit-oriented development and our partnership with Secretary Fudge and the department there is so important because HUD is doing a lot of work that can shape literally just the way our communities are formed, which then determines how much people need to move around before we even get to how people move around. And that can be half the battle. So all of these things are exquisitely interconnected. But I'll tell you, this is an administration that really encourages us to break across those silos to work these things. But I wonder, Robert, in your research agenda that you're leading, how you're seeing some of these opportunities to encourage active transportation or even just to deepen our knowledge about alternatives to vehicles.
Yeah, I think you hit on quite a few of the points that we've been looking into as the department, be it from complete streets and really trying to make it more amenable to walk and bike, and what does that mean? But certainly, different cities and places have different needs as it relates to, walking, biking, and transit, and just being sensitive to that as well, to understand what are the set of alternatives for different land uses that make sense. And so, within FHWA, FTA, and others, there's research programs that, about complete streets. And they're not in opposition to, the climate work. I mean, because we know that as we shift people, people take advantage of biking and walking in transit. That's also, one, safer, but it also at the same time, reduces carbon emissions. And so I think there's a really nice nexus there for complete streets and that type of mitigation and shifting activity. So that we've been doing that. So I think we have time for one more question. So shall we launch into that? Maria Ellis asks, very happy to see this administration acknowledging the past harm that we as DOTs have created for many historically excluded, marginalized, and vulnerable communities. In Portland, Oregon, we saw the decimation of the Black Albina community with the Interstate 5. How does the Secretary see the administration helping to address these past harms via future investments in infrastructure? Would additional funding be available to state DOTs to help leverage additional outcomes for communities as part of transportation infrastructure? So it's kind of a compound question, but
Yeah.
the floor is yours.
Well, the nature of the question, I think, illustrates something very important about all of our work, especially with regard to surface transportation, which is so much depends on the state departments and the local departments and the MPOs as well. But so much of this, of course, happens through the states. And so we are looking for states, as it sounds like a very enlightened questioner, raising the intention that's gone into this and in the community of state departments of transportation that we work with daily. We really want to encourage the kind of problem solving that you've been able to do on the ground and support that materially, which is why we do envision concrete, pardon the pun, dollars going into these kinds of efforts. We got to start by doing no harm. I mean, this is not just a distant artifact of the historical past. There are projects being considered probably right now as we speak that, if we're not smart about them, could repeat some of those mistakes of the past or misdeeds of the past. But of course, we also know exactly what happened in many communities, and I'm glad you raised Portland. This is not just something that happened in some isolated pocket of the country. Every part of the country, north, south, east, west, from Portland to St. Paul to upstate New York, a lot of different places have these stories, and now we can do something about it. And I've been thrilled to see almost every major newspaper, actually, in the last week, I've noticed, put out some kind of really interesting explainer or graphic or article about what it would mean to be able to replace or remove, bridge over or under some of these highways that were routed often right through Black neighborhoods or other minoritized communities. And I think we also just need to continue to do some education work on this. There was a pretty fierce reaction to my mentioning some things that I thought were taken to be a bit obvious about this. So we need to just lay out the facts, not in the spirit of guilt, but in the spirit of how are we going to fix it. And since so many of this damage was done with federal dollars, it's abundantly appropriate to do a lot of the improvements in the healing and the next step with federal dollars, which is exactly what we intend to do. But to end where I began, this is not something we can establish a message, even line up some resources. But folks on the ground, cities, certainly state departments can really lead the way on this. And we want to hear what you're doing, because I love nothing more than to highlight where there have been successes or to support great visions, and then hope that will, or do my part to make sure that will catch on among your peers. So thanks for paying attention to this, and look forward to working together on that.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Secretary, I want to just thank you for joining us and kicking off this thought leadership series. What an incredible start. There is also a tremendous lineup of speakers, but ultimately I want to thank you, thank the attendees as well. I'll turn it back over to Ann Allworth, the Director of Volpe, to close us out. Ann?
Thank you, Robert, and thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. We hope to see you at Volpe in the not too distant future when traveling is a little safer. Thank you all for being with us today. We hope you can continue to join us for the remainder of this important conversation about the future of our transportation system. Most of the will be at noon, not at 12:30, so just note that's a different time than when we started today. The next speaker will be next Tuesday, June 8th. Dr. Ed Carr, Director and Professor of International Development, Community, and the Environment Department at Clark University, will speak on a climate resilient future is an equitable and just future. So we hope you can join us next Tuesday at noon, and have a great afternoon. Thank you all very much.